Hello, and welcome to the first official edition of Casual History. I'm so excited to start sharing this information with you guys and just kind of building on your ideas and your comments and taking this to places that I wouldn't even expect. A little background on the show or the channel. So it's extremely casual, as you can tell. What I'm going to be doing on my end is I'm going to take you to random different areas. We're going to set up shop, and we're going to talk very casually, very briefly about certain parts of history. So the first one was a topic suggested by my friend Jack. It was the Siege of Petersburg. And before we get into that, I do want to say one crucial point that's going to actually be a big component of the success here. First of all is that I depend on you guys. I'm not going to come up with the topics myself. I would depend on you, your comments, your responses, your votes, to help decide new topics. And I think eventually we may end up getting, maybe some pictures or some animation, but I do want to keep it casual, okay? There's no big expectations here. We're just here to learn, to share, and to explore different topics together, and I'm really excited about today's topic. Like I said, it's the Siege of Petersburg. So this is coming at the end of the American Civil War. That conflict lasted from 1861 to 1865. Then the Siege of Petersburg is actually starting in June 1864, leading all the way up to, I believe, May 1865. So it's the very end of the war, and it's notable for two reasons. First of all, it's the clash of the titans, really. When you really think about Civil War history, it's the clash of the titans. So you've got Grant and Lee. Now, Lee has been, obviously immortalized in statues and history books. I think most of us have probably seen the Lee statue recently getting taken down in Richmond, which we can maybe do an episode on the lost cause later, but we want to talk about Lee's history during the war. So Lee actually was offered overall command of the Union Army. He turned it down, joined the Confederates, and then eventually became the commander of the Army of Virginia. So Lee is kind of the big dog out here in the East. Lee's in the East. He's in Virginia. He's in the Washington area. That's what's getting the most press coverage. When you look at European coverage of the war, that's what people are really commenting on. Lee's out here winning a stunning set of victories, along with Stonewall Jackson and, Longstreet, Jeb Stuart. A lot of his, sub-commanders are very famous in their own right. But who's Grant? Grant is going to be opposite Lee at the Siege of Petersburg, but we don't really know who Grant is, and not a lot of people did on the Union side as well. Grant's been out east. So he's been responsible for several good victories, very, very amazing victories, like the taking of Fort Donelson, the Battle of Shiloh, and of course the Siege of Vicksburg. But Grant has been out west, kind of separate from command. But after the Siege of Vicksburg, which in effect was the taking of a walled city, imagine like Minas Tirith in Lord of the Rings. He basically laid siege to Minas Tirith, cut him off, and captured 30,000 Confederate soldiers. At this point, he's come to the attention of Lincoln. Lincoln says, oh, this guy can fight. This is amazing. What are we going to do? What Lincoln decides to do is take Grant, put him in overall command of all his troops. So now Grant moves east to take command of the Union Army in the east. And of course, this sets up the clash of the titans, like I said, Lee versus Grant. So now that you've got this matchup, these two titans of the war facing off against each other, to be honest, it becomes a slugfest. You've got the Battle of the Wilderness, which saw some of the most horrific fighting ever in the Civil War. This is pre-Siege of Petersburg, so it's right before the siege. But you've got, just horrific stuff's going on. You've got guys who are getting injured, getting shot, getting wounded. They're laying in brush, and the brush catches fire because of all the shells and all the shot going through, so they're burning to death. You've got just horrific scenes, stuff that people have never even imagined before. And remember, this is already 3 years into the war. And I think really, before we dive into the Siege of Petersburg, I want to just make it a point to say that we're seeing the high casualty numbers and the high fatality rates because both of these commanders are so good. Where in the past, one person would pull out or one person would, feel the need to conserve their troops or their ammunition. Both of these commanders know that they're almost in the end game. And Grant's not going to back down, and Lee was never the type to back down. So after the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant makes this momentous decision not to turn back. Despite his horrific losses, he decides to push on towards Richmond, and Petersburg is in the way of there. Lee is a little bit shocked, but he doesn't really know Grant. What does Lee do? He decides to fortify Petersburg to try to stop their advance to Richmond, Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy. But war is changing at this point. Their horrific losses throughout the whole war, but especially during the Wilderness, have led both men to believe that you can no longer charge your men across an open field and just like straight into the guns and expect them to win. Lee has noticed at this point, especially after, you can think Gettysburg, especially after Gettysburg, he knows that he can't lose half of his army, a third of his army by charging these guns. He has to play a little bit more smart, a little bit more defensively. So what is his next move after that? Is to entrench. And at this moment, you see what I think is the most second important part of the battle or the Siege of Petersburg. The second most important part, besides these two commanders, is the use of trench warfare. This is very initial, and I always tell people that I think it's almost like the pre-show to World War One. It's the warm-up for World War One. Okay. Warfare, like the weapons of warfare, have not gotten to the point of machine guns or accurate artillery, but they have gotten good enough that men and commanders have started to realize that they can't just charge across the field. The cavalry is becoming less important. Now it's all about taking a position, holding it, and waiting for your enemy to attack. So knowing this, finally realizing this, Lee lays a series of trenches outside of Petersburg. Grant initially, conducts several charges against the siege works. He can't do anything. The losses are horrible. They're almost as bad as the Wilderness. He realizes he has to kind of pull a Julius Caesar and create a second line of trench works here. If you want to go even crazier with the Caesar reference, maybe Grant would build a wall on the other side, but we're not going to go that far. What I want to really emphasize is that this is, in a sense, the first initial trench versus trench long-term battle that is really reminiscent of World War One and of what's to come. But Grant, he's still an offensive-minded guy. He still is a product of his age, so he's always trying to kind of cut the flank off of the Confederate forces. Lee's always responding by stretching his trench lines farther. Eventually, you have 30 miles of trench works, 30 miles of Confederates and Union men facing each other. A couple highlights about what ends up happening. So, and this one's extremely famous. So, some of the troops under General Ambrose Burnside, who is a Union general, he's famous for inventing the sideburn. The sideburn, Burnside. Anyway, so he's got some people, a brigadier general, or maybe, I don't remember what his rank was, but he used to be like a mining engineer from Philadelphia and from Pennsylvania. So he's got a bunch of Pennsylvania miners in his group, and they say, what we're going to do? We're going to tunnel underneath the Confederate position. We're going to place a bunch of dynamite and gunpowder down there, blow it up, and then we'll attack through the hole. So Grant approves it because he's getting desperate. They eventually do that. It works almost perfectly. Unfortunately, the attack... Okay, so give me 1 second. I told you it was going to be a casual video, right? What happens is the mine does work, and it blows up a huge crater in the middle of the Confederate position. They rush attackers in there. The Union does. But it's very poorly timed. One of the commanders is drunk, and what ends up happening is many of the Union soldiers are caught in the crater, and they're massacred by the Confederate soldiers around them. And in kind of a cruel twist of fate, many of those soldiers were African-American soldiers who were led in there by incompetent officers and led to their deaths. Long story short, after this, of course, that's a big controversy, and it's still controversial today. long story short, eventually, Grant extends his lines long enough that Lee just can't keep up, and Lee has to pull back out of Petersburg. After Lee pulls back out of Petersburg, they have to abandon Richmond. So Lee sends a telegraph to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and he catches Jefferson Davis in church, and Jefferson Davis stands up and walks out in the middle of the church. And after that, the Confederates start to abandon Richmond, their capital, and that's really the death blow of the Confederacy. After this, Lee will try to make his escape, trying to join other Confederate armies, but Lee eventually chases him down, and of course, forces a surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. That's the Siege of Petersburg in a nutshell. A little bit of backstory, a little bit of the action. I want to just end it by saying, what I said earlier, that it's significant for two reasons. I really think because it's the clash of Lee and Grant, the two titans of the war, the best military minds of the war. They're finally fighting each other head on. And secondly, and what I think is even more important, is that this is the predecessor to World War I. And European observers from France and Britain and Germany, they're watching this, and they're realizing as well. But I think that you'll notice in the first couple years of World War I that they don't take their lesson too well. But I think that Grant and Lee could have told them a few lessons that they learned about charging in a entrenched position. So there you go. There's the Siege of Petersburg. It was great chatting with you guys. Very casual, like I said. If you have any other ideas or stuff that you want to see videos of, go ahead and throw that out there. I'll be posting a video whenever I feel like it. It's very casual. So, thanks for watching, and have a good night.